Hi, my name is Andrew Gunawella. Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. I'm delighted and honored to have former Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, joining me here today. Director Clapper served as DNI between 2010 and 2017 under President Obama. He has also held several key positions within the U.S. intelligence community. He also served as the Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency from 1992 until 1995. He was director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency between 2001 and 2006. And in 2010, when President Obama nominated him as a DNI, he was unanimously confirmed by the Senate, serving through the duration of President Obama's term. Of course, we know of the many accomplishments, challenges, and the rapidly shifting geopolitical dynamics that occurred during his tenure there. He is also retired a lieutenant general in the United States Air Force as well. And I wanted to bring Director Clapper on the podcast today to talk about a lot of the stuff that's going on in the Middle East right now, particularly in light of the potential for conflict between Israel and Iran, and already the strikes we've seen between those two countries. So, Director Clapper, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So, Director Clapper, what was the threat matrix in the Middle East when you left office in 2017? And how does it compare, in your view, to what we're seeing right now?
Well, I think the fundamentals of the conditions in the Mideast in 2017 were are essentially unchanged. I think those factors and parameters and circumstances are, I think, in higher focus, a much sharper focus. I'll put it that way. You know, but the fundamental animosity between Israel and Iran and others there has not changed. The um, presence of the proxy groups, Hezbollah, Houthis, etc. It's just that the situation has gotten more acute, I guess I'd say. First, because of the Hamas attack on the 7th of October, and then the subsequent exchange between Israel and Iran, which a very significant watershed event, I think. And the way those strikes, the strike and counterstrike was conducted, I think is quite significant and quite interesting. And I think the fundamental thing there is that both nations have kind of crossed the Rubicon in that previously, during the 40 or 45-year-long shadow war, so-called, between Israel and Iran, there had never been direct attacks from one of them against the territory of the other. Well, that threshold has now been crossed. The Rubicon's been crossed, and a dangerous precedent has been set, even though the results of both attacks were pretty benign. So I think the fundamentals, not different, but things much more acute because of recent developments.
So, I guess when you were director under President Obama, what did you see as the biggest threats in the region then? And I guess, as you've said, we've crossed the Rubicon with some of these strikes. What do you see as the biggest sort of flashpoints or threats in the region since, those strikes have taken place?
The major preoccupation in the region then, of course, was Iran and Iran's developing nuclear capability. So the Obama administration expended a lot of time and energy in negotiating what became called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, to put the brakes on the development of nuclear weapons and the progression along that timeline with Iran. So that was the principal preoccupation. It's not to say that the Obama administration was ignoring or was ignorant of Iran's nefarious activities in the region. It's just that the conclusion which I think was correct, was that the most pressing, most dangerous threat was a nuclear capability of Iran. So that's where the energy was first in the negotiating the JCPOA and then in engaging Iran's compliance with it. So that, of course, is going by the wayside with the Trump administration withdrawing from the JCPOA, which essentially removed whatever guardrails existed. And of course, at this point, the Iranians are now enriching at least to the 60% level. And it's, short jump to highly enriched uranium, 90% or so, that's needed to produce a weapon. And of course, the thought was that the breakout time would be at least a year under the regimen imposed by the JCPOA. Well, I think that's pretty much going by the wayside now.
Do you think that we could get back to the JCPOA at any point in time, or tension just too volatile, too strong, especially with Iran's hardline leadership right now?
No, I don't think so. And it's primarily because I don't think we can reassemble the global coalition that was pretty unified in imposing sanctions, economic sanctions on Iran, and that I don't think we can reconstruct that coalition. And without it, I don't think there's any way to impose the pressure on Iran now that we were able to during the Obama administration.
So do you sort of think that then like a nuclear-clad Iran would still be that biggest threat in the current day?
Well, I'm not so sure about that. And I'm actually not real sure about, I think about the Iranians' actual intent to have a nuclear weapon. Now, that could all change because the current Iranian government is much more hardline than its predecessor. Those around the supreme leader, much more hardline than advisors that prevailed in the day. So I think now there's much more focus on. So just to finish the thought there, I would say that, of course, the supreme leader has eschewed the development of a nuclear weapon, and as my own assessment is that the Iranians used whatever progress they chose to make at whatever slow pace they chose to make, they use that as a bargaining chip, as a way of trying to pressure the West and led by the U.S. to re-engage with them on a deal that would help improve the economy in Iran, which is a serious challenge for the government. But again, in the absence of so I'm not sure what their real intent is, but to show progress towards, as though they were making progress towards developing a sufficient highly enriched uranium, more as a way of pressuring, attempting to pressure the West, led by the U.S., into initiating negotiations again. And I don't see that happening, frankly. So now I think the greater threat, at least in the immediate proximity, is the chain of events that's starting with Hamas's invasion of Israel on the 7th of October. And that's set off a new chain of events, which I think pose potentially a great threat to stability in the region.
So, now shifting into that sort of war in Gaza, it's certainly that it tops of minds for many folks in the foreign policy community. We see a lot of social turmoil in the United States, around the discourse around the war in Gaza. But I sort of want to ask you from an intelligence standpoint, what shocked you, I think, most about the October 7th attacks?
Well, what shocked me, shocked many other people, was the apparent total surprise on the Israelis were clearly caught flat-footed. Now, obviously this is some sort of intelligence failure, no question about that. I was surprised because I recalled my visit to Israel, and I think it was in the 2014, 2015 timeframe, don't exactly remember when, traveled to the West Bank and toured along the line of the Gaza border, and was briefed on the extensive surveillance apparatus that the Israelis operated along Gaza. And it was my impression that they had a pretty tight um, insight, very tight overview of what was going on inside Gaza. So it came as a big surprise to me. Now, of course, that's several years ago that they seemingly took their eyes off the Gaza ball, and I think became consumed with other things in the West Bank and frankly in internal politics in Israel. And I think they felt that apparently that Hamas represented a more benign threat than it really did. So, at some point, I suppose there'll be a detailed investigation, much like ours after 9/11, to determine just what happened. It appears from what I've read that there was some insight and some knowledge of Hamas's intent to attack and the nature of the attack that was held at some level in Israeli intelligence. I noted the Israeli Defense Intelligence chief has resigned over this, which is probably appropriate. And the question is, did any Israeli policymakers, or decision makers, were any of them aware of the intelligence that did exist, that the Israelis did possess, at least at some level in their intelligence organization?
And I think certainly, I mean, a lot of questions should be asked, of the Israeli government with, that inability to sort of predict those attacks. But, you mentioned your visit to the Gaza border in around 2014. And I'm sort of curious about, how was Hamas generally assessed in the 2010s in terms of strength?
Uh, the fact is, Andre, I don't remember a lot of discussion about Hamas. It just frankly wasn't didn't seem to be on Israel's scope. And to be honest, we looked, I certainly did personally, but institutionally, I think we looked to the Israelis because of their, very capable, very sophisticated intelligence capability. We kind of looked to them for the insight into that region and threats that were posed to Israel. So if Israel wasn't focused on Hamas, then we weren't either, to be honest.
So, and just because, I mean, when we talk about October 7th, we see the comparisons to 9/11. Uh, and as you said, like we look to Israel for that intelligence gathering capability and so on, but their eye was seemingly sort of off the Gaza ball. Is that sort of similar in your view to sort of the U.S. approach towards Al-Qaeda in the 1990s? I think I'm asking you this particularly for the younger audience who may not have been who may not have been alive in the 1990s, when we were first talking about.
Actually, the intelligence community at that time, led by George Tenet, what was sounding the alarm rather loudly about the threat posed by Al Qaeda. And it was a question of when, not if, they were going to mount some sort of an attack against the United States. There was I think, a President's Daily Brief item in August of 2001 that at least provided what I would consider strategic warning. There are those who argue that doesn't count for much, doesn't help you much, since we didn't have the detailed insight into the nature of the actual plot. So there are a lot of parallels and similarities there, but I do think the intelligence community was aware and tried to sound the alarm. I will say there's somewhat of a philosophical issue involved here. And that is the difficulty that people have internalizing a threat that they have never experienced. And so I've often fantasized, if George Tenet, for example, went very public and said, we're sort of onto a plot here. We don't completely understand it yet, but it involves the commandeering of aircraft and using them and weaponizing them. So accordingly, starting next Monday, you have to go to the airport 2 hours early and take your shoes off and subject yourself to searches. Well, how do you think that would have been received by the American public? It would have been ignored. And I think my point here is that people generally have trouble embracing, internalizing a threat that they actually haven't experienced.
Do you think that that sort of philosophical issue, do you think we've gotten better at, I guess, addressing that philosophical issue, in our with our counterterrorism agencies, our officials, and so on, since 9/11? I mean, we just saw that ISIS-K attack in Moscow, for example, which was horrifying. And I mean, it seems like the threat of I think lone wolves as well, striking us in various ways is so high, especially since, we thought that, say, ISIS was gone, for example, but ISIS-K is still very prevalent in Afghanistan. Do you think that our eye is on the ball, I guess?
Well, I think more so than, and particularly in the CT arena, there was a whole um, array of organizations, National Counterterrorism Center, to name one, that were spawned as a result of 9/11. So that we have a government apparatus that is aware of and has taken this on as a mission. And so we're still, I believe, watching the threat of terrorism, certainly more so than we were prior to 9/11. So I think we do learn sometimes the hard way about these threats. The problem, though, is what about some threat that we haven't experienced? I've often wondered about if someone were either a nation state or non-nation state, for that matter, attacked our agriculture, killed our crops, killed our livestock. Not, not all of it, but enough to make a point. And we've never had that happen to us. And the intelligence community is pretty good at cooking up scenarios, threat scenarios. That's the easy part. The hard part is getting anybody to believe in them.
No, absolutely. And that's the scariest thing. It's as Donald Rumsfeld said, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, So mean, that's the biggest concern, I think, in the national security lens. But sort of on that point about counterterrorism and so on, I think when this war had initially started, President Biden had said Israel should hopefully not make the same mistakes that the United States did after 9/11. Of course, many people have strong opinions on Israel's conduct in this current war in Gaza. How do you view Israel's conduct in the current war?
First, I think the president and the administration are kind of in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Just about anything they do or don't do will be criticized. The president himself, and I think that's reflected in the administration's policy, is a very staunch supporter of Israel and has been for many, many years. So I think his instincts are, of course, to support Israel. Israel, for its part, I think the goal of quote destroying Hamas is not possible. I think what they're by the manner in which they are conducting combat in Gaza, they are only going to spawn more terrorists. They will make it easier to reconstitute and recruit for Hamas. Now, having said that, urban warfare is a very nasty, brutal affair. There's no question about it. So on the one hand, I'm concerned. I'll put it this way, and I say this as a longtime friend of Israel. Many personal friends and colleagues from my intelligence associations in Israel over decades. So I say this as a friend of Israel, and I'm very concerned about long term the conduct, the manner in which they're conducting combat in Gaza, and the I think gratuitous killing of innocent civilians and gratuitous destruction. And I can't see how that's all going to come out in a good place. I really don't. What's needed long term is, of course, some sort of a political solution, a two-state solution, I guess. And right now, the conditions for that are not very positive. And certainly the current leadership of Israel has not the least bit interested in negotiating anything that would result in a two-state arrangement.
I mean, you certainly served as a DNI for 7 years, right during Prime Minister Netanyahu's, I believe, his second sort of stint, his longest stint in office, right? Because he came into office in around March of '09, and so on. So, I mean, how do you see Prime Minister Netanyahu's goals, his motivations, and his political positioning? And I guess, as an observer now, do you sort of see that those political interests come out in the way the war is being conducted?
Well, you can't help but wonder that, given his legal difficulties, whether perpetuating his tenure in office serves the purpose of avoiding prosecution and jail time, I guess. So the cynics in the crowd could argue that with some basis that one of his motivations here is just to stay in office as long as he can. And of course, if you say that our objective is the destruction of Hamas, that is an endless task that will never, I don't believe, or can ever be achieved. He is wedded, like it or not, to a right-wing coalition in the Knesset. And he has to do their bidding, and their bidding is no two-state solution, I believe. And what exacerbates the situation even more, of course, are the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, both licit and illicit, which are growing. I was always concerned when I served as DNI that at some point there will not be enough territory that would make for a viable state geographically for the Palestinians. And that situation certainly hasn't improved since I left government in 2017. So it's hard to be optimistic long term about the situation in the Mideast, particularly given this recent exchange between Iran and Israel, and the threshold now for a wider conflict, which I don't believe either Israel or Iran want. But the prospects for that are unfortunately higher than they were before that exchange.
I mean, I sort of had to wonder, like, is this a different Netanyahu than the one who was in power in the 2010s? I mean, I know he and President Clinton certainly had some disagreements, let's put it that way, and he famously had some I think some strong disagreements with President Obama. But when you see the way he's sort of operating right now, particularly with that new sort of right wing, sort of more ardently right wing coalition with Ben-Gvir, for example, as the Minister of National Security, do you see a different Netanyahu than the one who you potentially had to work with back in the day?
No, I don't. I think he's pretty true to his colors and is pretty consistent. The big disagreement during the Obama years was over negotiating with the Iranians and the JCPOA. I felt, from an intelligence perspective, that the agreement was a good thing principally, again, from my standpoint, because of the extraordinary access and the surveillance regime that the Iranians permitted, which is unprecedented for any country to allow a foreign group to observe their nuclear capabilities. Now, were they completely forthright about past transgressions? Probably not. I'm not sure it was that important. I think what was important is, okay, the imposition of the agreement and compliance with it. And up until the time I left, the Iranians were complying with the terms of the JCPOA. That was a major source of friction, in my view, between U.S. and Israel at the time. And I never, frankly, understood that because I thought that the greater insight into what Iran was actually doing, the combination of the surveillance that was permitted under the terms of the JCPOA, augmented by our intelligence capabilities, independent of that, that we have pretty good insight into what was going on in Iran with respect to their nuclear development. And for whatever reason, Netanyahu, as the spokesman for the government, didn't agree with that, didn't see it as enhancing Israel's security, which I personally felt it did. And I don't think his basic instincts, his political stripes have changed since then.
So, as you said, you believe that, the longer this war goes on, the more sort of terrorists you will ultimately create. And I, certainly, I think, agree with that vantage point because it's very difficult to eliminate an ideology. And in sort of my view, sort of personally, I just feel that, like, just these significant civilian casualties, these images you're seeing will just breed more extremism and drive more people to join, those types of causes. I mean, like, what's your view on that threat matrix, the counterterrorism threat matrix? And I think particularly also potential terror threats to the United States from like homegrown extremists who are being further radicalized by a lot of the coverage they're seeing in Gaza.
Well, I think it's clearly a possibility that witnessing what's going on in the Gaza and the wanton death and destruction, as best I can tell, and has caused very intense feelings in the United States, as we've seen with demonstrations on college campuses, the growth of anti-Semitism in this country. So it creates an atmosphere and a circumstance that a homegrown terrorist could conceivably lash out and take some action here and within the United States. And the intelligence community and the FBI in particular is certainly acutely aware of that potential. So it's, to quote, paraphrase Dave Petraeus' famous question, tell me how this is going to end. And I have trouble seeing how it's going to end, and certainly under anything remotely resembling a favorable circumstance.
And that's a scary thing. And I mean, a lot of the domestic ire has been directed towards President Biden. As you said earlier, he's sort of damned if he does, damned if he don't. And I think regardless of what he does, he's going to be criticized by one wing or the other. And, I certainly wasn't alive for this, but I sort of was reading about in the early 1980s during the war between Israel and Lebanon. I was reading some coverage about President Reagan being a bit tougher, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but President Reagan being a bit tougher with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and sort of reading some stories in the New York Times about Reagan saying you're, committing a Holocaust, using those words. Begin, of course, took that very personally, and there were some tensions, even though we now remember Reagan as sort of this, very pro-Israeli president. But, that was sort of out in the public, I guess, in the early 1980s that Reagan, may condition aid to Israel. And, certainly a wing of the Democratic Party is calling on President Biden to potentially condition aid to Israel to take a tougher stance on Netanyahu. How do you assess the administration's current approach? Do you think more needs to be done?
Again, this, just speaking for me personally, I do think that it would be better if there were some conditions attached to the weaponry that we are providing Israel. You think my understanding, what you use 2,000-pound bombs for is destruction of building structures, etc. And I do think it would be useful is if we did with proper warning to the Israelis, we attach conditions of how just exactly how they're going to use these weapons that we provided them. And if they're, because as of now, we are implicated. We're sort of complicit in what Israel is doing in Gaza. And I think some restraint is in order. And I think the U.S. could probably do more to impose some restrictions and restraint on the Israelis' use of weapons that we provide them. I'm not. I am loath to make any other suggestions right now. I'm certainly not suggesting that we, cut off assistance to Israel. I don't think that would be a mistake, but I do think we could do more to influence how they conduct combat in Gaza.
So I guess not to speculate, but and I don't certainly want to speculate, but I mean, like, why would you think that we're not already doing that, for example? Like I guess like what's the hesitancy with doing this? Because I had an interview with Secretary Panetta a few weeks ago, and he sort of said a fairly similar thing. If his condition was if the invasion of Rafah occurred and there was more sort of destruction, we should condition the aid. So I guess like why isn't that happening, I guess?
I don't know. I'm not the one to. I don't have insight into that. I think it may have to do with President Biden's own personal convictions, his own personal support of Israel, and he is perhaps, and I'm speculating here, is just reluctant to do that, to try to put the reins of restraint on Israel. I don't know why. I think it's not that we wouldn't provide these weapon systems, but I do think it would be prudent to impose some conditions on how they're used.
So shifting away from the war in Gaza to the potential for broader conflict, as we sort of started the conversation with that conflict between Israel and Iran, where I think a little more than a week or two out of that exchange of strikes, or at least the most recent occurrence of, I think, Israel strikes on that, I think, site in Iran. And again, we're recording this on April 26th, Friday afternoon. So who knows what'll happen over the weekend. But how do you see the situation between those two countries today? As you said, right, like we've crossed a Rubicon in terms of how these strikes have occurred. But I mean, do you think that this potential conflict will actually escalate? So I feel like from what I've observed, it's like, okay, like the Iranians are trying to sort of play it down. As far as I know, the Israelis haven't necessarily acknowledged it. So in like my view, it seems like, okay, like they're trying to tone it down. But when you say they're crossing the Rubicon, it seems like there is the potential for severe escalation.
Well, I think the way both countries conducted their attacks is very interesting, and I think we perhaps gained some insight from that. In the case of Iran, they telegraphed what they were going to do. And in fact, I think they actually provided warning via the Turks of their attack. And then the way they mounted the attack, where they sent very slow-moving drones, which took a matter of hours to get from Iran to Israel. Well, they did all that intentionally. And I think they did expect to wreak more damage and destruction in Israel than they did. I think they mounted the size of the attack, which is quite significant, in the expectation they would do some damage. Well, it turns out they didn't do hardly any. But nevertheless, after telegraphing the attack in advance, and then they ended it and said, made an announcement, the attack is over, even knowing, I would guess, that how ineffective it was. Then the expectation was, well, the Israelis are going to really hit back now. There's no way the Israelis will sit still for this. They will have to do something. They can't not do something. And then it appears they went into a period of deliberation and debate, I would guess, internally about what to do. And they ended up doing something fairly modest. They certainly, I think, conveyed a message that the essence of which was the still extant technological superiority of the Israeli military. And so they did, I think, convey a message, and then it was over. So what's happened here is, yes, both countries have crossed the Rubicon where they've directly attacked the territory of the other from their own territory proper, which really hasn't happened in the 40 or 45 years of the so-called shadow war. But they both displayed restraint in doing that. And the message, I think, is that neither one of them right now desire a wider war. Now, the question is, how long will that hold? And if one or the other decides to attack, again, it will be, I would think, more effective on the part of either one of them. So that Rubicon's been crossed, and I think that barrier or obstacle, whatever you want to call it, that has existed in the past doesn't exist anymore. And the threshold for all-out active combat is now lower. Now, the question is, how will each of them restrain themselves? What will be the stimulus for another attack or an exchange of attacks? We don't know that. You have to watch and see. So it's the situation in the Mideast has been made ever more tense because of that exchange, as benign as it kind of both attacks were.
So you mentioned that shadow war that's been occurring, and given what's been happening in Gaza, given these strikes between Israel and Iran, we have, I think, a lot of first-time watchers who are now sort of tuning in more with more of a microscope, right? In terms of our general audience, we're now like watching what's happening in the Middle East. What has that sort of shadow war, that proxy war, generally looked like?
Well, up until this point, it's the Iranians doing things against either Israel or the U.S. or other countries out there through their proxies. So the Houthis in Yemen, for example, who themselves, I suppose, with at least the tacit approval, if not the urging of Iran, is basically threatening commercial traffic in a critical maritime transit area there, the Red Sea, the Straits, etc. And I think the Iranians have seen the viability of using the Houthis for that purpose, and thereby putting pressure on the world's economy. And then, of course, Hezbollah, which is armed to the teeth, and I guess upwards of 80,000 Israeli citizens have had to leave northern Israel because of the threat posed by Hezbollah. And they do just enough each day, 6, 8, 9 incidents of attacks of some sort to keep the Israelis on pins and needles. And of course, there are the militant groups in Iraq that are at least sympathizers with Iran that pose a threat to the U.S. And the same is true in Syria. So Iran, I think, is happy to sacrifice, fight to the last proxy soldier, if you will, and they'll continue to do that and maintain the indirect pressure on Israel, which has been a staple in the Mideast for at least 40 years.
So when we talk about these proxy groups, I'm sort of curious to sort of understand this a little bit better. What is that relationship between Iran and the proxy groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis, the militant groups in Iraq? What does it practically look like? Is it sort of the Ayatollah sort of like commanding these people to do something or just support?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I know the answer. I personally have. I don't think it's an ironclad. You know, make a the supreme leader makes a pronouncement in Tehran, and that's a direct order that must be carried out by a proxy group. I don't think it. I'm not sure how it does work, but I don't think it works that way. I think yes, they are in sympathy with and in league with Iran. They have similar philosophies, anti-West, anti-Israel, but I don't think they completely call the shots. And I do think the proxy groups have latitude to operate on their own and do. So I wouldn't profess to have detailed insight into just exactly what the command and control arrangement is between them.
So, a lot of ardent critics of the Israeli government, of Prime Minister Netanyahu, may say that, hey, there's an intention to pull the US military into, a potential conflict with Iran. President Biden, I know, has stated that we will not engage in an offensive with Israel on Iran. So sort of, flashing back to, your time in the Obama administration, what was the general view of a potential conflict between Israel and Iran? Was it viewed as a hyper-realistic scenario, or was it something as that, like perhaps they're like posturing in that way, but it's not going to happen directly?
Well, in the past, it's been, I think, largely posturing, and the Iranians would do certain things, the Israelis via the proxies, indirect, and of course they could always claim non-attribution, and then the Israelis, for its part, they would do things back to Iranian interests. And so whether or not that, that sort of informal, unspoken agreement will be sustained or not, I don't know. The U.S., you mentioned the U.S.'s public proclamation that it would not support Israel Israeli attack on Iran. Well, I wonder what the U.S. position would be if Israel attacked Iran and then, of course, Iran counter retaliated. Would the U.S. then come to Israel's assistance to defend against an Iranian counter attack? And I don't know the answer to that. So I did wonder about it when the administration made that pronouncement about, we're not going to facilitate, not going to help Israel with an attack on Iran, which we didn't. But then what?
So, as an observer now, you've been removed from government for about 7 years, but you're still an astute watcher and you're constantly on CNN, providing your perspectives and your expertise. When we're looking at the broader region, how, these other Middle Eastern actors, for example, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, how have you generally observed their posturing towards this Iran-Israel conflict or the potential for conflict?
Obviously, they're apprehensive about it. The airspace of both Saudi and Jordan, I think, was violated in the course of the Iranian attack. I don't know, maybe, well, I don't think that would be the case when the counterattack by Israel, but so they can't help but be nervous about, things escalating. Nobody to include both countries, both protagonists, Israel and Iran. Well, there's no one in the Mideast that wants a wider war under any circumstance. And so I think, countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan find the situation, menacing, and would like to tamp things down and calm the rough shoals. Again, not sure that's possible.
So, Director Clapper, I mean, this all sort of sounds awful and scary and terrifying, to be honest. Like, as we sort of had this conversation, if someone's like sort of tuning in, about this potential for conflict between Israel and Iran, the current war in Gaza, uh, I mean, what's your general forecast for the near future? I mean, as you said, General Petraeus would say, like, tell me how this ends. You don't know how this ends. Do we have any reason to be optimistic?
All I can see now is just kind of more of the same. I think the Israelis will continue to prosecute whatever they're doing in Gaza. And, you know, you worry about the hostages and how to get them free. And of course, as the more time elapses, I think the fate of the hostages is in more jeopardy. So I have trouble seeing sort of political pot of gold at the end of the rainbow here, with no inclination, no apparent inclination to negotiate. And again, I think the only solution, which I think is getting ever more difficult, would be some sort of two-state solution. And I don't see much incentive, certainly on the part of the Israelis, for having that. I'm not even sure the Iranians want a two-state solution.
So, as we close this interview out, we often talk about the U.S., their role in the our role in the Middle East, sorry. And we sort of, I think in the mainline news, we've viewed the U.S. as the primary superpower in the Middle East. However, how do you sort of see Russia, China, these other great powers, because we're constantly talking about the shift to great power competition away from those sort of non-traditional non-state actors, that we were fighting against in the 2000s. Yet it seems that, okay, like ISIS-K is on the move, uh, Israel's fighting Hamas. We're seeing these various proxy groups with their relationships with Iran. But, how do we sort of bring those great powers into this, China, Russia? How do you think they are sort of viewing this in general?
This is they're opportunists, and this is an opportunity for them. It's yet another way for them to attack the post-World War II order that, in which the U.S. has led and called the shots, essentially designed the international financial system. And I think the likes of China and Russia, North Korea, they all chafe under that. So you have this, I'm not sure I'd dignify it with the term alliance, but this convergence of views. The enemy of my enemy is my friend or something, whatever, where China and Russia see opportunities here to, make for a hard time for the United States. And I think that's what they're all united by that. I wouldn't call it an alliance, certainly, but just a convergence of interests and tearing down the traditional world order and the rules governing it that have existed since after World War II. So I think that kind of brings them together, and so they're gonna be there helping the Iranians wherever they can, military equipment and financially for that matter, and even I think North Korea has a role here. So to the extent that we are engaged in even indirectly in Ukraine, that the Russians view that as very provocative, and that's we're invading their neighborhood, et cetera. And so they're going to counter that with trying to expand their zone of influence, if you will, in the Mideast and now Africa. And they do it because of their aversion to the U.S. controlled world order.
On that note, Director Clapper, thank you so much for joining me here today. As always, for our audience, you can find him on CNN, where he's a national security contributor. But Director Clapper, thanks for being game for so many of these questions, for discussing your views on the broader Middle Eastern region, these conflicts, and for really, helping us sort of understand this from your point of view. Especially drawing on your time as Director of National Intelligence and your broader, decades-long career in the intelligence community. So thank you.
Thanks for having me, Andre. I enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.